grandfathers served in the Second World War. My maternal grandfather introduced me to the world of Canadian military history by sharing his stories and experiences serving in the with the RCAF as a tail gunner and a Halifax bomber. With the celebrations going on yesterday and today, I also want to make note that his birthday was on May 7th. So he had a very, very exciting 21st birthday. He was shot down in the March 5th and 6th bombing raids over Chemnitz and was prisoner of war. So this 21st birthday was a pretty huge day for him, and he used to tell this story about one of his crew members who also survived being shot down. He tried to make him this rhubarb pie underground because they were just liberated, and he said it was the absolute worst thing he'd ever tasted in his life, but it was one of the most meaningful things he's ever had on a birthday. My paternal grandfather, who is actually pictured right here, he's the reason I wanted to look at the Navy. He served as a signalman in the RCN, but unfortunately he passed away before we could really discuss his experiences, and I really would have liked to talk to him because he was about his experiences, because he was also an academic. He had his master's in history and went on to be to do quite a bit in terms of education in Toronto. So I think we would have had some really great conversations about his experiences. While I was taking an upper year summer course through Trent University with Dr. Richard Goet, who will be here tomorrow, a few years ago I read the article, "What is to be Done? The Future of Canadian Second World War History." This was an article J.L. Granitstein wrote for the Canadian Military Journal in the spring of 2011. And I knew I was going to be pursuing graduate work at some point, and I kept coming back to the topic of the Navy. And then I had the opportunity to read an article written by Terry Cobb about revisiting the Canadian military, which I'll discuss further in my paper. But my paper kind of stemmed from these two papers coming together, and I decided to write a think piece of what I personally feel is hindering the current historiography surrounding the RCN and where we can go from here. I also want to mention that it was for a condensed summer course, so the research is limited in terms of what you can do within that time period. The Royal Canadian Navy entered the Second World War with a fleet of 13 ships. By the end of the war years, the RCN was transformed into an elite big ship navy. In comparison to the study in the war in the air and on land, the historiography surrounding the RCN's contributions to the war effort is rather bleak. In the past, Canadian historians have acknowledged the accomplishments of the Navy, but tend to heavily focus on the theme of failure, and that's something that, having a personal connection to the Navy, it really didn't sit well with me. I found myself getting very upset and a little angry when almost every page has some kind of failure or loss or embarrassment, and so it kind of sparked me to really look into that. Between the smaller number of resources available and the negative tones in almost every written piece on the Navy, Terry Cobb's methodology of revisiting Canadian history needs to be applied to the study of the RCN in the Second World War. By revisiting the RCN and focusing on its accomplishments rather than historically and politically proclaimed failures, the significance of the convoy escorts can be appropriately analyzed and accredited with the incredible importance the men and the ships of the RCN had in achieving Allied victory. One of the main problems with the historiography surrounding the Royal Canadian Navy is that the opinion of the RCN was heavily influenced in the contemporary wartime views stemming from the British and the United States navies. According to W.A.B. Douglas, author of How the RCN Became a Blue Water Navy, one United States Navy commander went so far as to say that the entire class of British Navy officers thought the Canadian Navy was very ineffective. Mark Milner is a heavyweight in the historiography surrounding the Navy, and I'll be referring to him quite a bit because a lot of the books I used for research had a lot of great examples of these negative tones. In his book, Canada's Navy, the First Century, he provides his readers with numerous examples of the negative views of the RCN. One example was that Royal Naval officers felt Canadian corvettes were only useful for rescues. Roger Sarty, who is here today, in the German submarine offensive makes Canada a major maritime power, 1939 to 1945, addressed the isolation the RCN felt from the Royal Navy in the second half of 1941, when the United States Navy began to escort shipping to Iceland and controlling these trade defenses. This shows that the Royal Navy's preference was to the United States Navy over the Canadian Navy. And when I was reading about kind of the, I don't want to say drama, but the drama between these three navies, I couldn't help but get the image of the Royal Navy and the United States Navy being friends, and the Royal Canadian Navy being kind of the annoying little brother. And so, you know, like, yeah, you can hang out with us, and, you know, oh, we're not going to pay attention to you, but then when we need you, yeah, you know, we're gonna turn to you here.
Maybe years of work and that captures it.
Michael Whitby gives an eye-opening example of the way AFC Laurier, commander of Royal Canadian Escorts, would often speak about the Canadians, and I really found this shocking. Quote, "You can never trust a Canadian ship to do anything without being told 3 times," end quote. Not really, it doesn't really show well for someone who's commanding our escorts, but yeah, one of the main criticisms of the Canadian Navy was their equipment problems and lack of training. Milner explains that the equipment crisis started to appear in the historiography around the 1970s, and that most modern work does try to incorporate this theme. In the spring 1983 issue of Acadiensis, Milner addresses this concern by explaining that modern equipment such as anti-submarine warfare and navigational equipment greatly impacted the efficiency of operations in the Atlantic, and that Canadian escorts were about a year behind the Royal Navy in terms of equipment. Whitby explains that because of the rapid growth and expansion of the RCN, that infrastructure and training could just not keep up. Another prime example was when the British were unhappy with the Canadian losses in the mid-Atlantic. In Canada's Navy, Milner gives us a really good quote from Winston Churchill. It was a message that he sent to Mackenzie King in December of 1942. Quote, "A careful analysis of the attacks on our transatlantic convoys has clearly shown that in those cases where heavy losses have occurred, lack of training of the escorts, both individually and as a team, has largely been responsible for these disasters. I appreciate the grand contributions of the Royal Canadian Navy to the Battle of the Atlantic, but the expansion of the RCN has created a training problem which must take some time to solve," end quote. This was a huge blow to the Canadian Navy. While the theme of inexperience was common in the views of the RCN at the time, there were some who actually questioned whether training was the primary reason for these losses. There was actually a Royal Navy Lieutenant Commander, P.M. Bliss, who disagreed with this view, and he felt that when C groups, referring to the Canadian groups, were brought up to the technical level as the B groups, we would see increased efficiency. One of the biggest failures recognized by contemporary politicians during the war years was the inability of the RCN to produce a large number of U-boat kills. Just as a side note, I chose not to address the U-boats in the St. Lawrence. I feel like quite a bit has been written on that already. As most of us know, Germans adopted a wolf pack tactic, which allowed submarines to hunt convoys across the Atlantic. In a chapter written for the book Decisive Campaigns of the Second World War, Milner explains that the reality was that Canadians did face large losses from U-boats, but, quote, "the nationality of the escort sailors had little to do with the alarming losses. Slow-moving convoys escorted by poorly equipped groups battling 10 to 20 U-boats in the air gap for days on end were just simply a recipe for disaster," end quote. One thing that we really must remember when we're looking at the Royal Canadian Navy and the transatlantic convoy system was that the objective was not to sink U-boats, it was to ensure safe and timely arrival of shipping and to support the war effort overseas. The historiography on the RCN does not compare to the written works on the Army and the Air Force. Again, in Acadiensis, Milner acknowledges, quote, the contrast of the ink spill over Vimy and Dieppe is startling, end quote. He also notes that the historiography of the Battle of Atlantic has strongly been influenced by British authors. And there was one book in particular, Donald McIntyre's U-Boat Killer, which he calls the most damning criticism of the RCN in print. It is clear that Milner has made attempts to give the RCN the recognition they deserve, but even in his writing, there's still a hint of negativity. And I found the way he ended one of his chapters in Canada's Navy, the first century, was quite interesting because he compliments the Navy, but he's also beginning with a negative. Quote, despite these embarrassments, the Canadian Navy's accomplishments between 1939 and 1945 were among the most remarkable in the annals of naval history. To begin with, the negative is just perpetuating the theme of failure that is linked to the RCN. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the official histories of the Canadian Navy, but there was definitely a lack of urgency in terms of the compilation for naval operations. They are excellent in quality, but the issue comes with the time they were published. Dr. Gilbert N. Tucker was the author of the first two official histories, the Naval Services of Canada, its official history. The first volume looked at origins in the early years, and the second volume, the activities on shore during the Second World War. These volumes were finished in the late 1940s, but they weren't published until 52 and 62. I'm just going to skip over because Roger talked a little bit about the official history, so I'll save some time there. Okay, so a historical team in the 1980s were able to finally access the records from Britain, the United States, and Germany. These were documents that had been classified, so that's the reason that there wasn't they weren't able to write the official histories properly right away. So the Department of National Defense ended up approving 2 additional volumes of the operational history, No Higher Purpose in a Blue Water Navy. These books are absolutely wonderful and are full of very informative details. After I wrote this paper, I ended up buying them right away because I just really enjoyed the content. So I'm very excited that one of the authors is sitting here today.
Make sure you autograph it.
I even called a friend. I was like, is it inappropriate to ask the panel chair to sign my books? So to me, this raises the question, why were these resources not sought after earlier? The unfortunate thing about these resources is that they were published in 2002 and 2007 after the majority of the men who served in these vessels had already passed away. In the winter of 2007, Terry Kopp wrote the article 21st Army Group in Normandy for the Canadian Military History Journal. In this article, he presents a methodology of re-examining Canadian history, and although Kopp's article is in regards to the Normandy campaign, I feel it can be applied to the Navy. He requests that historians view battle situations not as failures, but rather as realities. And he explains that it's the commander's responsibility to advance the goal of winning, and historians' responsibility to explain what happened, rather than issue a pass or fail grade. To revisit the Navy, one can assess the challenges the Navy faced, but more emphasis needs to be placed on the achievement of the seamen and how their contributions helped the overall war effort. Canadian historians refer to moments of embarrassment and failure, but the Canadian Navy stepped up to the plate, and although they had moments of weakness and loss, they were able to mature into their Atlantic responsibilities when it was absolutely crucial. I also want to make note that there were so many wartime volunteers from the Royal Canadian Navy's Volunteer Reserve, showing that Canada's citizen sailors rose to the occasion despite the incredible dangers they were facing, which I think is just unbelievably admirable. The growth of the RCN is often portrayed in a negative light, but historians and politicians should not have blamed the Navy for expanding at a rapid rate. The Allies were engaged in a total war. This meant total commitment. The Navy was forced to fill the needs of the Atlantic to contribute to this war effort. The Canada at War website includes information on Canada's contributions to the war industry. The production coming out of Canada was absolutely massive, amounting to a contemporary value of over $10 billion. Canadian industry was able to supply materials to the Allied countries, a lot of which had to be shipped across the Atlantic. In Canada's Navy, Milner outlines the accomplishments that can be attributed to this growth. The Navy personnel numbers grew more than 50 times by the end of the war and took on vital tasks, which included protecting the North Atlantic trade routes and escorting the convoys across. Milner continues to explain that the RCN contributed to the sinking of 31 U-boats and 42 surface ships. This shows that even though there has been criticism for the RCN's expansion, the Navy would not have been able to achieve these results without the rapid growth. The role the RCN had in escorting convoys was a crucial one. The Juno Beach Center website provides information on the convoys. They were required to escort and protect merchant ships crossing the Atlantic, ships that carried essential goods such as military equipment, troops, fuel, food, and building materials. Convoys were set up in a grid system, so they would have the merchant ships evenly spaced in columns with the most dangerous and important goods at the center of the grid. It was vital to keep these dangerous goods well protected within the convoy because if tankers were hit, they would explode, and if ships carrying iron ore, they would just sink incredibly quickly. The escorting destroyers and corvettes would be positioned on the outside of the grid, and they would sweep in a zigzag pattern to cover a wider area with the detection systems. The merchant and Navy sailors took part in these escorts and convoys. They constantly faced risk of enemy submarine and challenging weather. One thing for me that's very important in any research I do or any paper I write is to include the voices of the men and women who served. I feel that sometimes we get kind of caught up in what's going on and we forget to really think about the people that were out there on the ships. And so there's some great resources, primary resources available. The Memory Project is one I really enjoy because you actually get to hear the words from veterans, and there's other resources like Salty Dips, that kind of thing. So I looked at the Memory Project website and I pulled a couple quotes from sailors just to explain in their own words what was going on and their own experiences. Lawrence John Moscowy described the fear linked to the weather conditions. Quote, "We were as much scared, a lot of times of the weather as we were of the enemy. But if you were a signalman, as I was, on watch, you stayed right where you were on the bridge." End quote. So no matter what was going on, someone in the position as my grandfather was would have to be out there on watch, because you never know what was going to happen. Milner provides a humorous but realistic commentary on the weather conditions, noting that Americans, quote, could only look at the Canadians in wonder at what they did under impossible conditions in their small ships surviving vile weather. They ought to receive submariners' pay. One USN Old Salt recalled, "The corvette spent so much time underwater." Another serious challenge that these men took on was the difference in convoy speeds. The Juno Center explains that slow convoys were ships that could only sail under 9 knots, which made their route extremely more dangerous for those involved. And 9 knots is roughly 16.5 kilometers an hour, so that is not a very fast-moving convoy. Gerard Rosenberg, a sailor in the RCN, recalls his experience escorting a slow convoy. And I apologize, it is a little graphic. Quote, "The first experience I had of note was a convoy called Slow Convoy 42. It was in November 1941. It was my second convoy. I had taken the first one over without too much incident, but this particular one we had 125 merchant ships and 4 escorts, 3 corvettes, 1 destroyer. The wisdom of the people who were in charge was that we would go up north towards Iceland and then drop back down, avoiding U-boats at that time. However, we were spotted as we were approaching Iceland, and for the next 6 days we had U-boats attacking the convoy on a constant basis. As soon as 8 subs would come in, discharge their torpedoes and leave, 8 more would come in. This went on for 6 days. We lost a lot of ships, a few tankers. We were pulling burning sailors out of the water. None of them survived. It was too bad because they were all alive when we picked them up. We had other ships, munition ships, blow up, a lot of loss of life. There was a lot of loss during that period. End quote. This was a reality for the men aboard these ships, and unfortunately for the Canadians, they were often stuck with the slow-moving convoys. They could take up to 17 days to cross the Atlantic, and it's a journey that you assumingly would be on high alert the whole time. In a post on the Canadian Naval Review in May of 2012, Ken Hansen addressed the significance of losing ships in convoy crossing. Hansen lists the cargo capacity of a 10,000 deadweight ton ship, which could contain, quote, food for 225,000 people in the UK for a week, or military vehicles to equip 1 infantry battalion, or bombs to load 950 medium or 225 heavy bombers, or the aluminum to build 740 fighters, plus carried as deck cargo 2 twin-engine bomber aircraft and lumber to build 94 bedroom houses, end quote. It's undeniable that the loss of this cargo would be detrimental, but in war, losses must be factored into the equation, especially when the convoys were up against the wolf packs. If one looks at this list in a different perspective, the amount of cargo that the convoys were bringing across the Atlantic to Britain, it's easy to see the enormous contributions they made to the war effort. The main goal of the convoys needs to be addressed as well. In retaliation to the political pressure put on the RCN to sink U-boats, a blue water navy illustrates the RCN had a great responsibility. Rear Admiral L.W. Murray addressed this. Quote, the Navy was not only responsible for the safety of ships at sea, but for their every movement, their warfare at sea or in the harbor. It is the Naval Service, not the Air Force, which prepares the ships for inclusion in the convoys, routes the convoys, organizes the destination of ships as required by the Ministry of War Transport, prepares the port for the arrival for the acceptance of such a large body of shipping at one time, and in case of a breakdown or attack, it is the Navy that must arrange the rescue tugs, salvage measures, and escort to docking ports for the care of survivors, end quote. So you can see the enormous amount of responsibility the RCN had. There was a great deal that went into the successful journey of just one convoy across the Atlantic, and the RCN had convoys leaving roughly every 6 days. The Royal Canadian Navy had many significant moments that helped in the war that helped build autonomy and gain recognition they desperately wanted. Milner argued that in 1941, the naval intelligence and control of shipping in the North Atlantic was excellent, while giving credit to Ottawa for its ability to act as a competent regional center. And this was something I had no idea about until I started digging into this research. Ottawa had a variety of different roles, from organizing convoys to intercepting German radio transmissions. And this brought the war much closer to home, actively involving Canadians on Canadian soil. The creation of the Canadian Northwest Atlantic Command in 1943 was another significant moment for Canadians, and being Canada's only independent theater of war with Canadian leadership. This was an enormous accomplishment for Canada and was a taste of autonomy and leadership that they'd been looking for. In 1944, the Canadian responsibility in the Atlantic was vital to the war effort. Canadians controlled the convoys crossing the Atlantic, while in the Eastern Atlantic they provided support groups that would go out searching for U-boats. Milner explains that the men in the Navy were, quote, distinctly Canadian in tone, brash, unruly by British standards, and by 1944, very good at what they did, end quote. Kind of reminds me of our Canadian hockey, just saying. During the Second World War, the RCN overcame incredible challenges while we're maturing rapidly to take on a huge wartime responsibility in the Atlantic. Enormous amounts of resources were needed to keep the Allied forces in the European theaters going, and the contributions of the RCN in escorting the convoys and carrying these supplies are monumental. By using COPS methodology and revisiting the way we look at the Canadian Navy, we can start to look at their challenges and successes from a Canadian perspective without British and American perspectives clouding our opinions. The veterans of the RCN deserve the recognition for their immense contributions throughout the war, especially in the dangerous wartime theater of the Atlantic provided. Without the ambitions of the RCN to fill these requirements of the transatlantic convoy system, the incredible feats of the sailors aboard the escort and merchant ships, the Allied victory may not have been achieved. Thank you.
Thanks very much.